Hi, I'm going to be talking about dead quantitatives and gestalt quantitatives, which I think are a really interesting grammar point. I don't know if I coined these terms. I think I did, but if there's another term for them, use that term because that person probably has more, you know, more juice in the linguistics community than I do. I'm just an ESL teacher who finds these things interesting. Um, so let me explain first, by way of some questions, what I'm talking about. So, a flock of sheep blank on the road. Please insert a be verb into the blank. Be verb meaning be, is, am, are, was, were, or been. Mostly I'm interested in whether you choose is or are. Okay, you have an answer? How about this one? A group of men blank singing. Is or are. A lot of people blank playing in the symphony. Well, so if you're like most people, you'll probably choose is for the first sentence. A flock of sheep is on the road because you would say flock is the subject of this sentence. So it needs a verb that matches that singular subject. A flock is one thing, and you use is for single subjects. I'm just going to call it the single verb from now on, or singular verb. And also, if you're like most people, you'll probably choose are for a lot of people are playing in the symphony. And you might not even have to think about this very much. You wouldn't really consider is a viable option here. And most people don't. Almost nobody. I'm going to say nobody a lot in this presentation, but I really mean almost nobody. A few people do. So yeah, are is the natural choice, and I think almost everybody agrees on that. When it comes to a group of men, people tend to be split in their responses, and that doesn't mean their opinions are less strong. I just mean I tend to get about 50-50 answers when people answer this question. So about 50% of people say is, and they're very strong in their opinion, and then the other 50% say are, and they're usually less opinionated than the people who say is. But what's interesting is how either one of these could be right, depending on how you conceive of that phrase, a group of men, at the beginning of the sentence. So that's really what I'm talking about here, is what causes people to choose is or are when faced with a subject like this, right? A subject with either what we call a quantitative or a quantifier. So people interpret a flock of sheep as a quantitative. Quantitative means like a noun phrase that refers to the number of something. So they interpret flock as the head of this noun phrase. So flock is the thing that we're talking about, right? So in this noun phrase, a flock of sheep, flock is the unit of analysis. It's what we're talking about. We call it the head of the noun phrase. And whatever is the head of the noun phrase, whatever verb comes next has to agree with that, not with anything else in the noun phrase, right? And that's why people choose is when they consider flock of sheep to be a quantitative and flock as the head, okay? On the other hand, when people look at a sentence like, or a sentence that starts with a subject like a lot of people, they make the opposite assumption. They call people the head of that noun phrase. And of course, when people is the noun phrase and people is plural, then are is the verb that you want because you want a verb that matches that plural subject. What's a little strange about this is that it appears exactly like the last noun phrase, which was a flock of sheep, in its structure. So there's no reason just in terms of the structure to choose people as the head of this noun phrase, but flock as the head of the last one, right? To give you another example that'll make this clear, why a lot of people is a very strange kind of phrase in English, is that any other phrase that looks like that, where you have a singular subject, like a friend, and then some kind of prepositional phrase like of dogs or with friends or with windows or something like that, nobody chooses the last part of that prepositional phrase, the noun at the end of that, as the subject, right? So if you talk about a house with windows, the house is what we're talking about, not the windows. If you talk about a friend of dogs, a friend is what you're talking about, not the dogs. Friend is the subject, and dogs are just some other information about the friend, right? So in most cases, almost everyone chooses what appears to be the head of the noun phrase as the head, and only a lot doesn't let us do that for some reason, right? So we interpret a flock of and a lot of other similar phrases as what we call a quantitative or a noun phrase where whatever comes after flock of is just some more information about the flock, but the flock is the head of that noun phrase. And so we consider that a single subject. On the other hand, we interpret a lot of and some other similar phrases as quantifiers, not as noun phrases. So when we look at a lot of, it looks like it could be a noun, but nobody hears it that way. Nobody interprets it that way, right? So nobody thinks a lot of is a noun phrase with lot as the head, right? We tend to interpret them like adjectives, like all or many or some other types of quantifiers. Okay, not as noun phrases in their own right, although they look like noun phrases. So I call these dead quantitatives because they probably started their lives as quantitatives, similar to a flock of, and people just began to interpret them differently. Because when people said a lot of people or a lot of dogs or a lot of things, they were usually talking about the things and not about the lot. And so phrases like a lot of just got reinterpreted over time as some extraneous information about the people, not as a subject in its own right. So that's why I call it a dead quantitative, because it no longer functions as a quantitative. Okay. So other similar looking noun phrases, or maybe non-noun phrases, like a group of, can be interpreted either way. They can be interpreted as a noun phrase or not, or as a quantifier. Quantifier is not a noun phrase, depending on the context. And we don't know all the reasons that people consider them noun phrases in some cases and not in others. But the point is, they're often interpreted either way, right? So I use the word gestalt for these. Gestalt is a word that usually refers, well, in philosophy it's something probably that I don't even understand, but I often see it used to refer to these kinds of images where when you look at it 1 second you'll see a bunny, or you'll see one thing, and you turn away and look again and you see a completely different thing, like a duck. And when you're looking at it as a duck, you can only really see it as a duck. You never see it as a mix of duck and bunny. But your perception of whether it's a duck or a bunny switches from moment to moment, but in those moments it's always just one thing. These Gestalt quantitatives have this character too, where in some situations you'll unambiguously see it as the subject of the sentence, and in other cases you'll unambiguously see it as just some more information about the subject, like a quantifier. Okay, so I call these, I call these pure quantitatives, and this group includes words like flock, where when you see a flock of at the beginning of a subject, you interpret flock as the subject, not as some more information about the subject. The ones that I talked about that almost never are interpreted as nouns, as noun phrases, I call these dead quantitatives because they probably started as quantitatives but aren't really anymore. So, for example, when you talk about a few people, the head of that noun phrase is people. It's not few, right? Or a couple of people. Almost no one says a couple of people is, even though couple appears to be the subject, right? Most people interpret it as with people as the subject. Okay, and then these middle ones that are sort of interpreted depending on context as, I call them Gestalt quantitatives. Okay. So what causes people to interpret a Gestalt quantitative one way or the other? It is, in my estimation, most likely how they understand the situation and how they understand this noun phrase in terms of what is the unit of analysis. What is the agent that's taking some action in this sentence? Is it what appears to be the subject, in this case group, or is it what appears to be the object of a preposition, in this sentence people? Right? If they interpret the group as acting as an agent, they'll usually choose a single subject, and then the verb is. If they interpret it as not acting as a group, not acting together, but just telling you how many people there are, then they'll interpret it as a plural subject and use the verb are, or use any other plural verb. So when people are jogging, they're generally not jogging with any kind of shared purpose. They're not trying to move the group from one place to another together. They just happen to have their own goals at the same place at the same time, and that's why they appear to be working as a group, but they're not really. So when you have jogging as a verb, most people use are. If you have a group of people are jogging, let's start this again. If you have a group of people blank jogging, most people will interpret the jogging as not a group activity, not something that the group does as one unit, but just something that people do, you know, with more than one person present, right? And that's why they use in this case, the quantifier group. In other words, they're interpreting people as the subject, and group is just some more information about the people, and so they interpret it as a plural subject and use the verb are, right? On the other hand, for singing, which is an activity that has a shared purpose and has the group acting as one agent trying to produce one thing, people tend to interpret that as a singular subject. So they'll say a group of people is singing, and it's because they interpret singing as a situation where people are working together to do something. So the group is the unit of analysis, right? And therefore the group is the subject, not the people. Okay? So why should you care about these? It shows something interesting about grammar, that people will regularly misapply the rules of grammar when they're told to be strict about grammar. And they'll give unnatural responses to which verb you should use in any of the sentences that I showed you at the beginning of the video. So what's important is if you ask them to be grammatically correct, they'll give unnatural answers, and answers that you know are unnatural because they don't match the way that people use these kinds of phrases in the real world, right? So here's a group of sentences that are from the real world. They all come from Coca. Coca is a online corpus that you can search. It's composed of real world language data. And these are the sentences that I took out of Coca, and I used these to ask a group of my Twitter followers a couple years ago, who are mostly language teachers, so they have a pretty nuanced view of language. I asked them which form of the be verb they would use in that sentence. So the sentence originally looked like, for example, a plethora of great mathematic books are available for elementary children. And when I asked my Twitter followers, I blanked out are, and I just said, which be verb would you use there? So you see these sentences as they were originally written in Coca, except I put square brackets around the verb. And then the blue bars underneath them are how many of the people who took my survey, and there were hundreds of them who took the survey, how many of them chose the singular verb, right? So how many of them chose is or was instead of are or were? And you see that in all cases, it's above 70%. So most people in all cases chose the singular verb. And then in a few cases, it's more than 90%, right? So people have some very strong opinions about using singular verbs for some of these. And sometimes it matches the original sentence, sometimes it doesn't. I put in red here the ones where it doesn't match. So the original sentence, the second one here, said a trio of toasts on the menu are served on a more rustic semolina bread. That's neat. But nonetheless, the overwhelming majority of my Twitter followers who took this survey, or the people who got the survey somehow passed on to them, chose is, not are, right? So you can verify for yourself that actually the way that people actually use these phrases, which I'm calling dead quantitatives or gestalt quantitatives in the real world, is pretty evenly split between plural and non-plural. So if you do a Coca search for a phrase like this, a group of noun, this just means return any noun, and then be in square brackets means any conjugation of be, you'll get results like this, and you can see, even in academic writing where you might expect people to be pretty strict about the rules of grammar, they use group of people with it as a plural subject just almost as often as they do as a singular subject. And then across other genres, it's similarly split, right? So in blogs, we have a group of people were, a group of people are, so those are with a plural subject, and then a group of people is with a singular subject, and they're roughly equal numbers, right? And just to narrow down the search a little bit so you can see the numbers more clearly, this is just a group of people and then be in square brackets. So you see again, plural subjects and singular subjects are about in equal numbers here, right? So in the real world, people use these gestalt quantitatives as either plural subjects or singular subjects in about the same amount, right? So, what this shows, the big takeaway for me at least, is when you tell people to use grammar, they'll apply different rules than they do when they actually use grammar to produce language in the real world. So, judgments of grammaticality actually use a slightly different and, in my view, simpler version of grammar than people use when they're actually communicating. And if you say, well, that's because they care more about grammatical correctness when you tell them to be grammatically correct, what do you think people are using to produce language in the real world when they're not being told to be grammatically correct? They're using whatever representation of grammar exists naturally in the head of someone who knows English, right? So that is what linguists are talking about when they talk about grammar. And, explicitly formulated grammar of the type that you're taught in elementary school is a different thing, right? It's a little simpler. And you can see that when you ask people to use, notions of correct grammar to judge things like Gestalt quantitatives or even dead quantitatives, you'll find their answers diverge from what people actually do in the real world. Okay, so that's why I think dead quantitatives and Gestalt quantitatives are interesting. And I think they say something important. And I hope you agree. Thank you.